So here's a little secret about watercolor that I'll let you in on. So my paintings often end up like this, but they first start out like this. First layer of paint is often very light in value and very watery, and you can see there might be a lot of areas that need some work and need some help, but it all comes together in the end through a series of layers. So what I think is really crucial to painting loose florals is the ability to let your paint dry in between, and then when you add layers on top, you can get lots of definition with darker value and tiny little details, and this will really help your loose florals pop. So I'm going to put another flower here, and I am going to show you how I make these sweet little peonies. I think when you are a beginner or you're new to painting flowers, it's helpful to start with the center. So I'm using a round brush, and I'm actually going to use a smaller one for this. I'm going to use this number 8 silver black velvet. It comes to a fine point, so that means I can get a lot of good detail. So I am going to paint a flower that's facing this way, and I'm going to start with the center. This will just help provide a guide for my petals. Making an oval shape, since it's not completely straight on, it's looking off to the side, and just putting in a few little hash marks. These will be the stamens. Then I'm going to take another brush. This is my number 12 by Princeton, the Neptune series of brushes. And let's go ahead and make that really soft, buttery, pinkish color. I'm using Naples yellow, a touch of opera pink, and a touch of white gouache. You don't have to use gouache, but sometimes I use it in my floral paintings because it gives a really soft, chalky appearance. If you don't have opera pink, you can use alizarin crimson. That's a nice warm pinkish red, and I'm using some of it right here mixed with that Naples yellow. And then we can start painting in our inner petals. They all point back to these little yellow stamens, sort of rounded. If it helps, you can turn your paper and you can even come at it from this angle by using the tip of your brush to sort of carve out those petal edges, which are a little bit uneven with peonies. I'm gonna grab some more of that opera pink because it's such a bold color, and just touch it in a few areas. Okay, so we got a couple of those inner petals. Let's keep on going. I watered my mixture down a little bit, and I'm going to start coming over to these side petals, which are a little bit narrower. I think what I'll do is have this flower tucked behind these other ones. Very loose, keeping the sides of the petals somewhat smooth, but the outer edges giving them some freedom to be a little bit jagged and uneven. That's okay. And while everything's slightly damp, I'm going to make a darker value, which is just less water and more pigment. So I've got a darker value going on here, and now I can paint in a few little marks while everything is still damp, and it will just softly fade. And sometimes I add a few little hash marks too into the center with that same color. Another thing I like to do is lift some of the color in some areas. So I take a thirsty brush, which is just a brush that's got all of the color removed. It's slightly damp, so I remove any excess water onto a tissue, and then I lift and remove. I find this works best when your paint is still damp. I'm not going to do this everywhere, but just in a few areas. I think it helps give the flower more dimension. And then we'll let it dry and we can add some more greenery and maybe one more little bloom right here. Now what I want to do here is make a little bud. So it's not completely open, it's just starting to open. And I want it to be more of a pinkish color rather than this peach color. So I'm going to add more opera pink. And I'm even going to add some white gouache so it's kind of closer to this color. And then I'm going to have it face off this way. Let's water it down a bit more, add a drop of water. And I'm just going to paint some C shapes, and they all connect at the bottom. Maybe one going like that, and it's just starting to open, so you've got some petals up above here on the outside. It's coming off the paper a little bit. Then I'm going to do the thirsty brush again and lift. And I might even drop in some darker color right there. So grab some more opera pink, a little bit of a darker value, and then just drop it in at the top and maybe at the bottom. Just gives it a bit more dimension. But right now is a good time to start painting in the rest of our petals, or the rest of our greenery. So let's grab that olive green and let's start putting it in. You can water it down to get it lighter. We can always darken it. It's okay if your green blends in with your paint that's still wet. That's totally normal. In fact, I think it looks really nice when colors bleed into each other a bit. I also like to put touches of green in the center. Now this is mostly dry, but I like to add a little bit of green here and there. I think it helps give more of some oomph. And I might do a bolder stroke right there. Maybe lift off some of that color, a little too dark. Okay. And notice how I left some of the petals completely bare, and this petal here is very light and these are fairly dark in value, and it's that contrast that really helps watercolor florals pop. And let's work on this one. That's sort of a bud shaped flower. I'm gonna start with that mixture of pink and alizarin crimson and yellow to get it sort of a medium color going. And I'm gonna start at the top, and then I'm curving down, not all the way, but maybe right here. I'm just picking out little pieces of shadowing that might be in the flower. Can deepen that top bit of the bud there. Yellow ochre, alizarin crimson. And now let's add some darker leaf shapes. I like to use a pointed round. This is my silver black velvet. And I'm using a color called olive green, but you can mix this color using yellow ochre and cobalt blue or ultramarine blue. Sort of a yellowy green, and you can deepen it by adding a brown, or if you have a dark green called perylene green, you can do that as well. But let's start with this olive green color. And we'll put in, I like to layer on darker. So I got mixed with perylene green, so a bit of a darker green going. And I find it's helpful to make different brush strokes. So sometimes I drag my brush and I pull it up to make a pointed leaf, and I'll do the same over here. And one there. But I like to start with a lighter leaf color, and then I layer on darker paint on top. I think it's helpful to define some of the flowers by adding some darker leaf shapes behind them, sort of tucking it in. And just as in nature, leaves are they take on so many different forms and shapes. You can make smaller brush marks by just tapping your brush on your paper. It's okay if some of your leaves overlap your flowers. Now let's deepen this part of the flower. You can also use this brush to paint in some leaf shapes. See, the green leaves kind of tie in with the green centers over here. Now let's do this flower. So we've got our first layer of paint that's completely dry on this flower. Now I'm going to add a second layer and even a third layer maybe, and we'll darken it up a bit and give it some definition. So instead of starting with the center, I think I want to start with some of these outer petals. I'm going to use this filbert brush, and I'll show you why I like to use it, because it gives some pretty clean lines, mixing up some yellow ochre with my opera pink. I want it to be a little bit chalkier, so I am going to put in a touch of white gouache, just a touch, not too much. And then I'm going to paint in some of these petals. If it helps to turn your paper, you can do that if you prefer to have your brush strokes come down. But you can also turn your brush like this, and you can get some lovely brush strokes this way. So I like a filbert because I can get these skinny little lines and also big, larger lines that come back in. And at this stage, I'm looking at petals that I can tuck behind other petals. Like right in here, I can carve out this little section right there and then connect it with this petal. And that just makes it look like this one is in front of it. And I might do a little bit over here though, because this area is lighter, I'm going to make this color a little bit lighter. So you can do that by adding more water. This will just dilute your pigment, get it a little bit more watery, and then you can go and create a couple more little lines. Just giving the suggestion of some petals that are tucked behind some other petals. That one ended up being a little bit too dark, so I'm going to rinse my brush, remove some of that water and paint, and I'm just going to lift that color up just a little bit. And I think I'm also going to soften this edge, just right there. There we go. I like the way that looks. Might even add a bit of edging over here. You can take the edge of your brush and just create some directional marks. I like to give my petals sometimes a bit of a lip or a little bit of an edge. There. And now I want to work on the center, and I'm going to be using some of my olive green. So I want to let this dry a bit before I start painting in the center. But while this area is still wet, I want to give this a bit more depth. So I'm going to bring this petal down just a little bit further. This little area here. I want it to come a little bit closer. So I'm taking a smaller filbert, and I have a little bit more control. And I'm making sure all my petals are coming back into that center. Soften this edge. There. Okay, so I'm gonna let this dry, and then I'm gonna go over it again and paint the center of the flower. So I really like what's going on with this one over here, and I'll show you how I made those little stamens. I'm gonna do the same thing with this flower. We're gonna have some skinny little lines with some blobbier little dots, and I'm using a very fine tipped brush, this silver black velvet, for those little skinny lines. And I might use a filbert for some of the dots. We will see. This is a number 4. I'm gonna mix up some of that olive green. And I'm going to pick a spot where you want your stamens to be a little bit darker. So mix up a darker color green using perylene with that olive color. And I am overlapping some of my petals. This flower is opening up more toward me rather than this one's kind of facing that way a little bit. So some of these stamens will overlap more in a circular shape. And you can make them different sizes. Then I'm going to take my silver black velvet, and this is where I can start getting a bit more skinnier lines. I really like using this brush for a texture. Now I'm going to rinse it, and I want a lighter green over here, so I just added a bit more water to the mix. It feels like my brush is too full of water, so I'm going to remove some. And now I've got a light color on my brush, so I can add some lighter stamens over on this side. Now I'm going to darken it up a bit and do just a few little dark marks, not all over, just in a couple areas. Pick a spot where you want to put more of your shadowing, and then over here I want it to be in this lower section, and that's where I'm concentrating the majority of my darker stamens and brush marks. And that will just give the flower some depth and interest, so it's not all the same value all the way around. I think this variety makes watercolor so exciting. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I can always add more later if I need to. But I think this loose approach to painting, giving it some breathing room, allows your flowers to look fresh and exciting. So I also wanted to show you how to get more definition in your flowers. So if you see some areas where you have really light petals and you could maybe tuck a leaf behind there just to give that petal some more definition, take a small pointed brush. I've got a number 6 here by Silver Black Velvet, and then just grab some of your green and let's carve out a little bit of detail here. So I'm just going to paint in a tiny little section right here that would give that petal more definition. And I'm going to soften that edge by taking a thirsty brush and removing some of that paint, just softening that edge a bit. So that just helps give that petal some definition. I might do something right there too. This little area here kind of looks like there could be 2 petals on that pinker flower. So I'm just going to create a little bit of an edge there. There. That's how you can get definition in your blooms. You can even put one right in here. I'm not going to go crazy and do this everywhere, but I do like to give my flowers some definition with that greenery in the background. And this is how I give definition to my loose florals, or how I edit a painting that just doesn't look quite right in the beginning. I go in with darker value and more detail at the very end, and I use greenery to help frame those flowers. I can't wait to see what you create, so feel free to share it with me on Instagram or wherever you like.